60 Minutes correspondent Lesley Stahl covered the White House for CBS News during George H.W. Bush's time as president and vice president. In 1980, it was Lesley who broke the news that Mr. Bush was chosen as Ronald Reagan's running mate. Lesley challenged Mr. Bush as vice president and later as president in the Oval Office after the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Walter, a top lieutenant just came and said, it's not Ford. They're coming all around me to tell me it's not Ford. Someone told me it was Bush. They said it's absolutely definite. Go with it. They're all yelling Bush all around me. Everybody's yelling Bush, Walter.
You were lampooned, to say the least, during the campaign for being so supportive, constantly loyal. If you do decide to run for president in 1988, won't that have hurt your image if you continue along always being so supportive and never standing out, making a separate position?
What would hurt my image if I tried to say these are the good things, but I secretly told the president that he shouldn't do this or that, because somewhere along you trip over something called character, and I couldn't do that to the president.
This is a sort of great victory for our side in the big East-West battle, but you don't seem elated, and I'm wondering if you're thinking...
I'm elated. I'm just not an emotional kind of guy.
And Lesley Stahl joins us. You were in the room, Lesley, where it happened. You and 41 seem to have a lot of history together. Integrity and class seem to matter to this man very much, and you saw that.
It was innate. Either it was innate or his mother pounded it into him. But that little clip about the Berlin Wall coming down, everybody in the world was, well, everybody in the Western world was celebrating that the wall had come down. People were dancing on top of the wall. And he summoned the White House pool reporters into the Oval Office to make a statement. And he was sitting there, just glum. Everybody was elated, and he was kind of slumped. And I asked him why. And the reason turned out to be, and I think Bob Gates told you earlier, that he didn't want to gloat, and he didn't want to, you know, rub Gorbachev's nose in the fact that we had won the Cold War. So there was you talked about integrity. He was decent. He had compassion. Henry Kissinger, I once asked Henry Kissinger, what makes a great leader? And he said a great leader has to have suffered, has to have faced a trial.
He certainly did that with the loss of his daughter.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that contributed to his compassion and his depth as a human being.
You've covered a lot of White Houses and all that. How is he different just in the day-to-day of being in and around the White House?
Well, I covered Carter, Reagan, and Bush. And I never saw Carter or Reagan wandering around the White House, you know, poking into offices. I personally ran into him at least 3 times in the first 2 years, just wandering, and he would say, hey, how are you? And tease, towel snapping. So he was a person, if you know what I mean.
If he was upset with the press, would you know it? Did you hear from him?
Not personally, but we knew it. You know, we had a press secretary who was the buffer. But I got many notes, and lovely notes, and they were all the kind of notes you've heard from other reporters. You know, all is forgiven kind of notes.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was going to say one other thing. When I was covering the White House, Barbara Bush had a meeting with a group of us, and we had lunch up in the living quarters. And then she gave us a tour. And 2 things I'll never forget. One is that she brought us into the Lincoln bedroom. It's the only time, I covered the White House for 10 years, the only time I'd ever been in there. And there was a toy box. I mean, grandchildren were a huge part of his life. He had a lot of them, and they came and stayed at the White House, and the toys were all over the place. You know, he was real, and he didn't try to say he wasn't real. And the other is that Barbara took us to a window right up there, and she said, look, and she could see right into the Oval Office. She could keep her eye on him if she wanted to.
And she said that she told him what was on her mind, but she told him in the bedroom, right? Not in the public domain. What was their relationship like to cover from your vantage point?
Well, they were so different. She was terrific, you know, authentic, real. She made a point of saying these aren't real pearls. It was a big contrast with Nancy Reagan from before, and maybe Barbara even made sure people understood the conflict. And he always made it seem that she was the boss. He talked about it. But I think she really was the boss. I don't think he just talked about it.
Bipartisanship
So
didn't seem
firm.
to be a bad word back then.
Oh, well, it's different time.
Yeah.
Of course, he came out of the World War II generation, and they had a code to live by that we don't seem to have anymore, which, in my opinion, is sad.
Mm-hmm.
What's amazing quickly is that it's Bush, Walter, with that clip we saw. Another thing is that Bush and Reagan had fought like crazy in 1980. So that's why it was such a great surprise that just saluting and joining the team, even though he'd been at such, had such bad fights with Reagan.
It's kind of a metaphor for the way he conducted his life. All is forgiven. I'm not going to hold anything against you because that's not my code. That's not the rule, the moral rule that I live by and have to live by and want to live by, and you have to admire that.
He famously told Reagan that I will never embarrass you as vice president.
Right.
Thank you, Lesley, for coming this morning.